This is a Pages of Hackney event recorded at BSix College on the 11th of November 2021. It was our absolute pleasure to welcome Dan Hicks and Errol Francis to discuss Dan's game-changing book Brutish Museums, published by Pluto Press. Dan Hicks is Professor of Contemporary Archaeology at the University of Oxford, Curator at the Pitt Rivers Museum, and a Fellow of St Cross College, Oxford. His award-winning research focuses on decolonisation in art and culture and academic disciplines, and on the role of cultural whiteness in ongoing histories of colonial violence and dispossession. The chair for tonight is Errol Francis. Errol was appointed CEO of Culturand in 2016. He is visiting professor at the University of West London. Errol was awarded his PhD from the Slade School of Fine Art, University College London, where his research focused on post-colonial artistic responses to museums. He was awarded an honorary Doctor of Letters from the University of West London in 2017. If you would like to buy Brutish Museums, please head to our website pagesofhackney.co.uk, where you can buy it for collection or delivery nationwide.
Welcome everybody, and welcome Dan. This is a great opportunity to meet in person and share thoughts on this really important topic. Now, the script I was given was that you were going to read a bit, but you're not going to do that. So
yeah, exactly. But I can talk.
Yeah. Do you want to kick off with you had a kind of overview or chronology of the last 18 months, which has been, for me, the most tumultuous year and a half in my career in the arts. I don't know for you, but how is it? And it kind of morphed into your publication of your book later in the year. So give us a context.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I guess the first thing to say is how wonderful it is to be here. What a great venue. Thank you for hosting us. And how lovely to see you, Errol, because we've been getting to know each other over lockdown and doing events and having conversations, and here we are in the same room as each other. So that's fantastic. What a weird time for everyone, obviously, on all levels. But in terms of writing this book, it's one of those things. People kept telling me that the book is timely, which felt really odd because it was that sense almost that a stopped watch in the form of the museum is going to tell the right time every 125 years, every 150 years, that actually there's something about the Pitt Rivers and other museums like it, the British Museum, the V&A, and how many of these institutions are across the UK and around the world, that they're somehow, we can see them suddenly in this time. And so in the book I talk about that sense that when something fails, you see it. There's a visuality to failure. You're on your way to work and the car won't start, and the car is like there in that moment in a way that it wasn't on any other normal morning. And so I think the colonial museum and the ideologies it was designed to kind of naturalise, but also to make endure, that's failed, and it's failed in slow motion in front of our eyes, not only in the past 18 months, but of course over the years and the decades recently. But it's come into focus in such an interesting way. There was something about the shutting of the museums and their reopening. So at the Pitt Rivers, when we reopened, after lockdown a little over a year ago, September last year, and we made the decision to remove human remains from display. That was a fascinating conversation because I don't know, certainly the museum had never in its history been shut for so long. And of course all of our museums were shut, actually around the world as well. So that pause led to various things. It meant that the culture pages of the newspapers didn't have exhibitions, and the constant sort of a turning of the wheels of the news agenda being led by the next exhibition that you must see. And so actually it was a time for reflection, I think, in all sorts of ways. People have been reflecting on their lives, on what they want out of life and so on, but institutions have been doing that as well. And I think what we want out of our institutions is also a part of that. So I think lockdown internationally has had that effect. When you shut the door on the museum, then the boundary between the storeroom and the display space is blurred, because the whole thing is revealed to be storage. So much of this conversation that we're having this evening is about items which are hidden away in the stores, items where we don't even know what's in the stores. You know, we have centred for so long our national institutions in this conversation. The restitution conversation for too long has been only about the British Museum. And I'm not saying that the question of restitution is not important for the British Museum, but a big part of actually what the British Museum seeks to do, you know, it isn't the British Museum, it is the British Museums. And in the case of the Benin items, you know, there are over 150 institutions that hold these items. So it's about decentering the richest and most powerful institutions who've sought to censor themselves. They've sought to dominate the space. They've sought to say that restitution is what, you know, activists outside the museum say they want, and those of us inside the museum who are professionals, who understand the sort of real world around these things, say no, and then it's a tug of war where actually it's, if I can mix my metaphors, the dice are loaded in the tug of war, you know, from the beginning. So my intervention in some ways was to speak not in any ways a lone voice, because so many in the sector, as you know, think the same as I do, as you do, but actually to use academic freedom. I mean, one of the, you know, there's a set of conversations that we can have about sort of privilege, about positionality, you know, and obviously a part of the privilege that I enjoy, I have in this sort of conversation involves my maleness, involves my whiteness, involves my working at an elite institution, a very well-resourced institution. In terms of the Benin items, that also includes access to knowledge. But for too long, we in our roles, you know, in arts and culture, have thought it enough simply to state your privilege and then reflexively, self-awarely represent the same image in these incredibly white institutions, these incredibly unchanging institutions. So the challenge now is not just to state my positionality, but in some ways to seek to undermine it. And that really, I think, was what the book was seeking to do. When I wrote it in a great hurry, between July of 2019, I decided to write it when I was in Nigeria at meetings of the Benin Dialogue Group, and I just felt there was so much misinformation from some of the institutions involved. There's such a need for this to be actually a public conversation, and one that happens in each of these institutions in its own way. So I wrote it between the July of 2019 and the February of 2020. So I completed it almost immediately before lockdown. You know, those first weeks of lockdown, I had to do the index, which was completely like, you know, you're locked away indoors and you've got this book to index. Because as you know, once you submit a manuscript, it keeps coming back in different ways. But it has been fascinating to see how what supposedly was a timely book, the world is changing, absolutely for the better. It's an incredibly optimistic moment, I think, for museums and arts and culture, but it's crucial we get this right. And that's why I'm really looking forward to our conversation, because, yeah, you know, I guess, I mean, we're both old enough to remember some points in arts and culture where we felt that a change was coming and that an opportunity was missed. So maybe that's a part of the framing for actually what we're going to say in the next.
Indeed, yes, yes. Thank you for that. And so your book comes out in November, and the thing that's
right, almost exactly a year ago.
Okay.
Yeah. A bonfire night, actually.
Right. What a firework it was. But I wanted to start with Black Lives Matter, actually, and the kind of interaction, if you like, of the events last year with what happened in Minneapolis with George Floyd, and then we get this what I thought was almost like a sort of ricochet effect, where something that was about criminal justice and social justice becomes a matter of about cultural heritage, and you know, we get the events in Bristol, and for me, when we had the statements from the various museums saying that they stood in solidarity with Black Lives Matter, by the time your book came out, it seemed to me that those statements actually drew attention to their own complicity, if you like, with a form of violence which you give so much detail to. What do you actually think about that? What do you think about the interaction between what you're saying in your book and these statements, well-meaning perhaps,
Yeah.
but how do you feel that they played out in relation to the narrative that you're giving us, the historical narrative?
So at the heart of this is that sense that the Black Lives Matter movement was not a moment, right? We've heard some of the politicians say, oh, it was a moment in the summer of last year. No, it's part of an ongoing anti-racist civil rights movement. And actually restitution and the fallism movement, you mentioned Colston.
Mm.
So fallism and restitution are both African-led movements with a long history. The first of the Benin items were returned to the Oba in 1938. The fallism movement was alive and kicking in Algeria in the 1960s, and has re-emerged at different points. And of course, in the book, I talk about the Rose Must Fall movement in South Africa in 2015, which crucially was a generational moment. That was a moment at which in 2015 apartheid, and of course, what a day to be talking about apartheid, as we're all remembering that shift that happened in 94, let's remember what the context was of those events of 2015, the Rose Must Fall movement in Cape Town, which was that there were students at the University of Cape Town, 18 and 19 years old, who'd been born after the end of apartheid, but still experienced institutional racism, other forms of racism on a daily basis in the academy. And at the heart of the academy was the image of Cecil Rhodes. So art and culture was being put to work, had been put to work in the early 20th century in this image of Rhodes, the mass murderer, the colonialist, the head of the South African Company, which was the South African version of the Royal Niger Company, which in the book I talk about, which is of course the corporate nature of empire in this time is incredibly important. So Rhodes was there. So there's that recognition, and it is a recognition from an African-led movement that art is not simply always a positive. That culture, even the culture concept in anthropology, has a history of violence, has a history of being put to work for not only to enact violence, but to make anti-black violence naturalised and to make it last. So when, in the autumn of 2015, through the Rhodes Trust, Zimbabwean and South African students and colleagues who'd been involved in those movements earlier in 2015 arrived in Oxford, found another image of the old bastard up in the centre of Oxford on High Street. What happened was a movement that started to point out a whole load of other ways, other forms in which empire had been celebrated, made to last, at the heart of the built environment of the city, of the university. So part of that were things like the naming of the Codrington Library at All Souls College after a Caribbean slaver. And so since then, actually, the library has been unnamed, but the image of Codrington actually remains there. It was about the old Indian Institute, which if you go to Oxford has all these elephants on the outside. It's now a different building, but there's this marker of a particular form of Orientalism there. But fundamentally it was about the Pit Rivers, and it was about items like the Benin Bronzes where there was an observation which I hadn't, at that time in 2015, we were feeling pretty good about ourselves at the Pit Rivers. We'd done actually restitutions of ancestral human remains to indigenous communities in North America, in the Pacific. We'd worked insofar as we could with what we thought was seeking to make a World Culture Museum sort of fit for our days. We'd saw the museum as a celebration of sort of different ways of living and different ways of seeing, but it hadn't, all of a sudden, there's this African critique, this really deep, thoughtful African demand that we recognise that these displays, every day we open our doors and we tell the story of the dispossession of the Oba and the destruction of the royal palace. No matter how honestly we tell that story, no matter how we tell the story, we're telling the story with these objects, and we're thereby making that violence last. We are hurting our visitors and hurting those parts of the community that we say we serve, you know, who will never even step foot into the museum because they know what it is. So this incredibly white institution is not only one that has to diversify itself in terms of who works in the museum, as indeed across the arts and sort of culture space, we have to talk fundamentally about sort of cultural whiteness. And that's really what the book turned out to be about. And that, I think, is the answer to your question, because once we see that art and culture can be put to work for those purposes, for the purposes of a story of sort of cultural supremacy that was so important to Victorian Empire, we have no problem in the world of natural history here, do we? I mean, if we think about the racist displays of human ancestral remains, of skulls that were put on display in so many anthropology museums around the world, that told the racist lie that there are different sort of types of human, the different species of humanity. Those displays were among the last sort of remnants of those were among the first things to be removed after we beat the fascists in 1945. Right? Suddenly, those narratives, insofar as they continue to be told, had to be removed. They're obviously wrong. They're obviously hurtful. This is obviously violence. But right next door, in the cultural museums, the cultural history, not the natural history museums, those cultural objects, art objects that have been actually installed in order to tell precisely the same narrative for precisely the same reasons, which is a narrative of sort of cultural supremacy, the myth of the primitive, the notion of the civilized, all these late Victorian ideas, you know, we haven't touched those because we have found it so hard to think that a statue or a museum display would be in any way anything other than good. And that, I think, once you realise that, once it's pointed out to you, as it had to be to my shame, had to be pointed out to me, I couldn't see it, it wasn't my lived experience, it hadn't occurred to me. Once that's been pointed out to you, you can't unsee it. And it's not that every object in the museum is doing that, but there was a period of time, actually quite a sort of narrow period of time, in fact, if we think historically, between the 1880s and the 1920s, a sort of proto-fascist period, where Confederate statues were being erected across the way from the courthouse across the American South, where images of Cecil Rhodes or of 17th century slavers in sort of Bristol or indeed London, you know, we're not too far here from the Museum of the Home, where there continues to be
like Jeffrey. Yeah.
That's right.
Yeah.
Where that hasn't been removed. So recognising that the museum, that the statue, the art, the culture can be put to work exactly like science, which is a good thing as well. It can be put to work for the purposes of violence and racism. That means we have to have a lot of work we need to do in our sector.
Yeah. But there's been a real counter-reaction to Black Lives Matter specifically, and more generally the politics of heritage. And I wanted to just cite a couple of examples of that. So we had the race disparity report, which said the most offensive line being, there's a new story to tell about transatlantic slavery. and we've had the retain and explain policy. There have been interferences with the boards of museums and blockings of appointments, and so on. So there's been a tremendous counter-reaction to this from the state itself. Do you think that that's a confident reaction, or do you think that it's a temporary panic response from a class of people who know that change is on its way?
So yeah, I mean, I'm doing some writing about this at the moment for the next book, actually, and thinking hard about those issues, which exactly as you outlined are so important. When you've got George Osborne as the chair of trustees of the British Museum, right? I mean, yeah. So the architect of austerity, which has just wreaked such violence against the museum sector, the civic sector, for more than 10 years now. What's he doing next? What's he doing at the British Museum? So and of course it's not for nothing that he's there, because some people, I mean, let's just make this point right at the start, which I mean we have to deal with on a daily basis, that people say to us who work in this space that actually arts and culture and museums is a distraction from the so-called real work of anti-racism, right? And of course, if it wasn't important, if it wasn't powerful, if it didn't mean something, they wouldn't have put all this effort in the first place to erecting all the statues and to looting all the artworks and to building all the racist museums. But more importantly, there wouldn't be this, I don't think it's a reaction, I think it's a continuity of that violence that we're seeing in the present. So I've argued that it's not a culture war, it's a war on culture, it's a war with culture. It has its origins in the late 19th century and it's still going on. So it's not that the hard right, whether in government or whether the campaigns to save our statues and all these people, it isn't that they are reacting. They'd love it to be, there's a mob in Bristol and we're going to save Winston Churchill from the mob. That's not it at all, This is not the taking of a movement about the aim to protect the living bodies of humans and to turn it into the defence of images of humans in stone and metal. Right? It isn't a reaction, it's an ongoing attack. So these are, I think you're quite right, these are the fight. It's getting nasty because they're losing their grip, because there's a wonderful line in Karl Marx's account of a protest in Hyde Park in the 1840s, which is about the loss of power of the church and the growth of a particular form of capitalism. And he has this incredible line about how when a monster is losing its battle, when it's weakened and it knows that it's about to be vanquished, in that moment,
it is most vicious.
It finds within itself the absolute uttermost strength. It's at its most dangerous. So that's what we're dealing with. We need to write this history of essentially white cultural supremacy. That's what we're talking about. So that's when I'm called out by my colleagues at the V&A, when Tristram Hunt, sort of calls me out in the press and says, "Oh dear, there's this person at the University of Oxford who is sort of dissing museums." The reason that they're so agitated is that if what we're talking about is not whiteness but cultural whiteness, then I'm a race traitor on cultural terms, right? I and others like me are not anymore going to accept the lie of cultural whiteness, the enaction of these stories of supremacy anymore, because we see the damage they're doing in the building. That's why they're trying to save the statues. That's why they're saying you can never do listed building consents on a building. This ridiculous that you can never alter a museum display. I mean, what nonsense.
Well, actually, I wanted to... You've come to an issue that I was going to ask you later about the power of the Secretary of State for Culture, but we'll come back to that. But I wanted to stay with this, this image you say of this flailing monster, if you like. One of the things that was said last year, this was David Starkey, he said slavery was not genocide, otherwise there wouldn't be so many damn blacks in Africa or in Britain. And when he said that, and he got sacked for it, and you could say that was an extreme, outburst from a complete nutter, but it made me think about the politics around, your argument, and which I absolutely support, around restitution. That does there need to be a kind of ethical and moral shift in relation to the history of colonialism that we haven't quite arrived at yet, which you are kind of encouraging, which is to say there's been genocide, this is a crime against humanity. Yeah. And comparing it to the Nazi Holocaust, what statements like this seem to suggest to me is that in order for us to have the legal shift, we need to have an ethical and moral shift that colonialism was genocidal and it was a crime against humanity. Do you think that we need to arrive at that point?
So I think one way of seeing this is to say that the civil rights movement was always, from the 60s onwards, about historical consciousness. What happened in the 60s and 70s, we could say, was a historical reckoning with a particular form of racism, form of empire, a particular sort of period of history, which was the history of enslavement, the history of colonisation. The history really of the 17th and 18th centuries, the early 19th century. And what that movement did was it pointed out that racism isn't just some human universal, it has a history. That history involves these incidents, these histories, these enduring histories, and therefore we need to address them. And actually heritage sites, arts and culture became incredibly important. So if you went to Colonial Williamsburg or to the Jefferson Monticello house, or, a little later if you went to the Museum of London, the museum in Docklands, or a number of other, even the V&A, you would see some recognition of those histories. What's happening now, and it's happening across Europe, is there's another phase to that ongoing social justice movement, which again is saying racism isn't just an innate thing we need to manage, a tendency we need to morally self-police. It's something that has a history, that history built into our historic built environment, it's around us, but those histories involve incredibly recent periods that were after abolition, after emancipation. They were the later 19th century, they were the early 20th century, they were the sheer level of violence enacted upon Africa and upon the global south, with the weapons of war, the technologies of war that found their way onto the soils of Europe in the 20th century. They started, so the story of the attack and the razing to the ground of the palaces in the city of Benin, the cultural desecration, the religious desecration, and so on. This is about hyper-modern technologies of warfare, the machine gun, and the electric lighting, and the rocket launchers, and the mountain guns, and the barbed wire. These were actually technologies that found their way onto the soil of Europe with such horror in the 20th century, that were being actively tested on African bodies in the 1890s. So across Europe, the commission that's been launched of inquiry into colonialism by the Belgians, who are looking at the Belgian Congo, by the Swiss, the way in which Germany is facing up to the Herero and Nama genocide in what is now Namibia, the French, with obviously President Macron leading on restitution as part of a historical reckoning with the French Empire. And of course, remember, he commissioned the Savoir report in 2017 that came out in 2018. And so my colleagues Felwine and Benedict, who, as I was saying to you before, are right this minute out in Benin as part of the ceremonies to receive some of these returned objects. They, at the heart of the restitution debate, they put the theme that shocked so many of the French experts in the museum world. So I was at the Musée du Quai Branly as a visiting professor at the time in that year, and when the report came out, all of my colleagues were like, oh my God, why have they've introduced this idea of consent? The language of sexual violence is in our museum. What is this about? This is terrible. This is wrong. But of course, it's central. The notion of consent in the present, the notion of the lack of consent in the past, the way in which we find agency in those who wish, through restitution in all of its forms, financial, artistic, about voice, about creativity, about visibility. That's about reckoning with this past. So once you, a bit like the museum itself, once you see these histories, once we recognise the sheer scale of the loss, the violence, the dispossession, the death that was enacted upon Africa and upon the global south in those periods, then we can start a process of social justice, of healing, but we start by telling sort of making it visible. And our museums, I think, at their best, our museums are spaces for having that conversation. They're spaces for memory, they're sites of conscience, they're war zones.
Yes, but can you achieve that if there isn't this some kind of ethical, moral shift that recognises the violence and atrocities committed by colonialism? I mean, just to give you an example, I'm working with the National Museum of Wales at the moment, and you probably know about the Thomas Picton portrait of this absolutely ghastly governor of Trinidad who actually tortured a 14-year-old girl. He was an appalling perpetrator of crimes against the people of Trinidad.
Yeah, he was actually removed because at the time, wasn't he? For his,
he was tried
crimes,
and then he got off. He was tried for judicial torture. He got off from he was acquitted. So his portrait is up in the National Museum of Wales, and I've been working with it. It's been a really interesting experience working with a group of black youngsters in Cardiff, deciding what to do with this this portrait. And it's a huge portrait of this guy, and we've commissioned 2 contemporary artists from Trinidad to respond to this history and this object. Yeah. And the portrait came down on the 1st of November, and we get Hugh Edwards, the superstar,
the BBC journalist,
newsreader, saying, I don't agree with this is doing down Welsh history, And if you remember Naga Munchetti, I'm sure you all remember Naga Munchetti, she's the breakfast newsreader, talking about the racism of Donald Trump, and she was publicly slapped down by the BBC for making her political views known. He says this, nothing's happened. So I'm going back to this idea that there is this continuing, if you like, epistemic violence of the cultural elite, of the political elite, refusing to acknowledge these crimes and their representation in art and culture. And so although one part of me is really, really optimistic, that your book, for example, has provided this impetus, this pushback from the state is really, really strong, isn't it?
Well, it is, but it's also actually incredibly London-centric, right? I mean, actually, the devolved regions, the fact that this work is happening, led by the devolved government, in Cardiff, look at what Edinburgh are doing. Yeah. Completely different set of conversations in Northern Ireland. I mean, where
it's a different legal framework. They're not under the same legal framework as
but also, actually, it's the concerns of a minority of the of the right wing, at Westminster, who are out of step with the French, out of step with the Belgians, out of step with the Germans. I mean, the reckoning with the Benin Bronzes, the reckoning with the atrocities that the British undertook in Nigeria and elsewhere, is being led from Berlin, not from London. I mean, what a strange world we live in on that level. So the Berlin Museum, I mean, let's just count them up.
Yeah.
So we've had last week, so we've had the physical returns from Jesus College,
Aberdeen,
University
Berlin, the Met in New York.
So we've got, the Met in New York. There have been further commitments from the Fowler Museum at UCLA. The Germans have said every single one of the Benin Bronzes, more than 1,000 items in the federal museums across the country, are going to be returned. You've got the National Museum Ireland, which is a fascinating example. So this was an outpost of the V&A in the early 20th century. And so it was a colonial museum, literally, because it was in Dublin before 1920. And there they displayed the Benin Bronzes in 1912, 24 of them on display. And what message was that giving to the museum goer in Dublin at a time at which reprisals of a very similar framing were going on in the south of Ireland?
Indeed.
What mess? And so there you've got National Museums of Ireland today thinking about these items in a completely different way to sort of all these other contexts. So we've now got an unstoppable and a whole load in the pipeline that aren't in the public sort of domain yet. So many institutions, except of course for the British Museum and the V&A.
And the national. I mean, there's something about the national museums in England, in particular, that are resisting all of this. And I was just wondering about what tactics we might use, because what we've also seen, the Secretary of State for Culture exercising a degree of interference in the operational and curatorial decisions of museums that we've never seen before. Should we wait for this government to die, or is it? Or I was saying at the Museums Association conference that I think that there is grounds for a judicial review of the powers that the Secretary of State is exercising. We have never seen a situation where the Secretary of State for Culture is telling a museum. I mean, I met the director of the Museum of the Home, and she said that she was called into Whitehall and told, you take down that statue, even though they weren't going to destroy it, they were going to move it. Yeah. She was told, you do that and your funding is cut.
So look, even in the case of the Cecil Rhodes statue, at Oriel College, where the decision, there was a vote by the governing body that said that they wanted to remove it. There was a student vote that said they wanted to remove it. The people of Oxford were out on the streets saying remove it, and then the principal, the head of house, said actually we've made the decision, but we're not going to do it. The only reason was a threat from the minister. So I mean, for a start, I think the first thing is we need some of these heads of museums, heads of houses to step up and to say, actually, we are going to do it. Let's see. Let's sort of, they need to call their bluff.
Yeah, no, I think, is it them, or is it a citizen like Gina Miller, for example, who said, look, you can't just bypass Parliament like this. It's not going to be, I don't know any new museum boss who's going to think, right, I'm going to challenge these inmates with what is their job worth. It's something that's going to have to come from outside.
It has to come from somewhere. Well, I mean, actually talking about it in venues like this is incredibly important, because who'd have thought that the technical, bureaucratic tedium of how the Secretary of State makes a public appointment to a trustee body of an arm's length non-governmental organisation, or actually the technicalities of listed building consent for a grade 2 star educational sort of a charity to make a minor alteration to a wall. When did that? What sort of politics is it that makes that matter?
To punish somebody who's they're proposing to punish somebody who damages a statue more severely than rape. So I mean, surely there needs to be some legal challenge to this.
The book talks. It's introduced. There's a whole load of made up ideas and made up words in the book. One of them is white projection, which I use as a way of trying to talk about the ideology of the punitive expedition, trying to say that my violence is actually a reaction to your original violence. This is a punishment, it's a reprisal, not, and of course the scale of the power, the scale of the loss and the damage is so different in all these cases. So the trumped up idea that that the museum or the statue is under attack and therefore it needs to be defended. That's an old technique that goes right way back. It has a commonality with the idea of the punitive expedition. How do you fight it? How do you say that? I mean, I attended my first event to remove Edward Colston in the January of 1998.
Exactly.
It was my generation that failed
yeah.
when I lived in Bristol.
Yeah.
We failed to remove Colston, and we tried to go through the very boring technical process of how you do the public consultation. And I lived there until 2007. Another missed opportunity, the 200-year anniversary of abolition, which was meant to be this moment where we all had a historical reckoning with enslavement and its history. It turned into a celebratory event, like we won. This was a victory for the British, like with abolition, emancipation, 2 world wars, and 1 World Cup, right? These are things of national pride. What we're learning is that abolition is not over, that emancipation is not over, that racism continues to be built into our institutions. And writing the Sewell report simply to make the claim that institutional racism doesn't exist shows, of course, that this government and that many on the right are seeking to undo some of the work, some of the achievements of anti-racism in the past 15 or 20 years in our lifetimes. But yeah, of course, it needs to be fought. I don't know what we do next, but restitution is definitely one exciting thing I think that the book is doing, that the movement is doing. Is it's devolving these conversations. So yeah, I mean, those of you that regularly would see that the Museum of the Home as part of your community, you need to be having that conversation with the trustees.
But they've been ignored. They've been totally ignored, and the director can't do anything. She's been stopped from enacting the wishes of the local community.
What's exciting though is that these conversations are multiplied across the UK, across the world now, and that's why we get Aberdeen moving, we get BSix College moving.
So when is Pitt Rivers?
When is Pitt exactly? I mean,
because Pitt Rivers has got. I mean, I've seen the. It's got a huge number of these. Why? There was a review. I don't know if you must have seen this review of your book in the Financial Times. I think it was in March. And the guy that reviewed it, he was saying, but Dan Hicks works at this museum that's got the stuff. Why don't they do something about it?
That's the whole point. I'm writing about my workplace, and the book opens.
What is that like though? To work at a place where the argument that you are making is there, and I mean, what is that like?
So that's exactly the point, right? I mean, so I use sort of Lindqvist's idea of digging where you stand, what he called the dig where you stand movement, that there's a kind of politics that starts from where you're, I mean, not just your positionality, as I was saying at the beginning. I don't just need to start by saying, here's who I am and here's where I'm speaking from. I need to dig into that to understand it, but also arguably to dismantle it. So yeah, I mean, it's not my decision to return the Benin Bronzes, but I also know that restitution, we know, because restitution is part of our ordinary working life as curators in the very different historical circumstances of Holocaust loot, in the cases of the return of ancestral human remains, in the case of indigenous communities, which, these are things that our museums do, all the time. So we know that those things take time, they build relationships, but they don't last, the talking doesn't last forever. So in the book I talk about a decade of returns, and if I would be shocked if we haven't returned the Benin Bronzes at the Pitt Rivers by the end of the 2020s. I mean, I'm certainly going to do my best to make sure.
End of the 2020s? That's too long.
Oh, no, I mean, we're hoping that the museum opens in 2024. I mean, I'd return them tomorrow. But I point this out to my director and to the trustees, and each institution has to go. I absolutely. I think they should go back now. I think we're going to win the argument. I think we're going to get there. And indeed, there was a really important moment a fortnight ago. So we've mentioned Aberdeen and Cambridge, but what we haven't mentioned is what the Legacy Restoration Trust actually achieved at the meeting of the Benin Dialogue Group in London at the British Museum, which is they managed to hand a letter to Hartwig Fisher, who is the director, which is, so the argument always was, we can't return them because no one's ever at them. It's absolutely ridiculous argument. We have, how many times does the Oba have to ask for returns? And is it really correct that he has to write to every one of the 165 institutions that are listed in the book, which isn't even a complete list? And it was just it was the first attempt anyone had ever made to list where are all the Benin Bronzes, right? That's what the book does. Yes. So maybe the Oba will write to all those institutions. But I think what happened in the case of Holocaust loot was that the Washington Principles of 1998 fundamentally shifted the onus of responsibility for knowing if there were stolen goods in the museum from the claimant to the institution. We should know ourselves, find out ourselves if we are holding items that are stolen, share that information, allow the demands to be made, and return on a case-by-case basis. And return the Benin Bronzes without a doubt. But let's also not think that the decolonisation of museums is solved after all the Benin Bronzes are returned. There are many other expeditions, many other cases, and much other work to be done. But that doesn't mean, but we have to start somewhere, and returning the Benin Bronzes is
I was meeting with
at
the Museums Association conference. There was the Collections Trust. As you know, they had a national database of objects.
Right.
I'm just thinking about your list, actually, not just of the Benin Bronzes, but other contested objects. Is this something that Pitt Rivers could perhaps lead on, is to get, because a database, a national database of these contested objects, of which there are so many, the Benin Bronzes are not the only ones. Isn't that a start also to having a system of restitution, is to know where these things are and what they are?
Yeah, I think there's a real danger, though. There are so many of the most powerful organisations, actually Oxford University among them, who are talking about formalising procedures. Let's get one big database of all the stolen art. Let's sort of build it together. And they're rushing into this. The risk is that, like the scramble for Africa in the 1880s after the Berlin Conference of 1884, and of course calling it the scramble for Africa, this kind of euphemism that makes it sound like it was some sort of Boy Scout day out rather than this horrific phase of world history that wasn't just about the Europeans elbowing each other out the way, it was about the mass slaughter of so many African people. There's a risk that we turn this now into the scramble for decolonisation, that there's some virtue to be gained in being the first people to return an object, to do this, that, the other. There's or indeed to invent the procedures. Because I think these, we're back to Audre Lorde. The master's tools will not dismantle the master's house, right? These institutions are not sort of neutral. They're not simply making the list. But list making is a form of violence in its own way, in certain ways.
That's a clever way of putting it. But going back to the Nazi example, having a list of...
There's never been an international list of all the
but when paintings... when paintings come up on the art market and people know works that were stolen by the Nazis, and they can be stopped from going on sale, or they can be taken out of collections, we do need some kind of information as the basis to...
What has happened in those cases, what's happening, and of course nowhere near enough has happened for human remains either. What has happened is a shift in ethical practice, in sort of curation, and a building up of knowledge, but in a very devolved way. I think there's massive dangers in one organisation to do all the restitutions, because you're going to create another neo-colonial...
No, I'm not saying it's one institution. I'm saying that Pitt Rivers could lead on, because you've got this... You've got the various grants from Open Society Foundation, whatever, to lead on this. So this is something that your institution could do to help.
So we will, within the next fortnight, we will publish the really detailed report into our initial estimate of 145 objects from 1897. That goes in object by object, photograph of each object, the detailed provenance, and it shows also those objects where we know they're from 1897, those where we think they were, but also other objects that were taken in other expeditions. So we widen it out. So that piece of work, I think, is actually what you're describing. That's about to be published literally any day. But I do think also that our role is not simply, as I've done, to make the lists and to be transparent. It's then to amplify the voices of those who are demanding returns, and to act and to be ready to act upon them. Fingers crossed, and it's beginning to happen. Right?
Okay, yeah, that's great.
It is a hopeful moment.
Yeah. It's hopeful. It is indeed hopeful. I do agree. When I think this was my last visit to Oxford. Actually, was the Mosai delegation who came to Oxford. It was I have to say it was one of the most upsetting accounts. Actually, about because you hear about these objects, but to actually hear the people themselves to whom these things belonged, and they said it's essentially we quoted all of what they said actually on our Culture and Instagram, and they said things like bad luck has been visited upon them because of the loss of these things, and that. They said things like they knew the families that these objects belonged to. They said that many of them had been labelled incorrectly, and so on and so on. But the most profound thing I think they said at the end of their statement, their visit, was that and this is, I think, the exact words: the museum should be a place of humanity and not of objects. And I thought that was just so profound, because it was a critique of the whole idea of a museum, and it made me think that actually, even after you've given back contested objects, the very model or the idea of a Western museum to display these things that have been acquired by various means was inherently inhumane. What do you think of that? Could you imagine a museum that doesn't rely on objects, the accumulation of objects in order to tell stories?
Yeah, so I think what we're hoping to build is a world culture museum where we care for people more than we care for things. But I think we need to be incredibly careful of the model of humanity that was at the heart of the building of the Pit Rivers in the first place, at the building of anthropology. That guy Anthropos, after whom anthropology in the 19th century was named, the notion of universal humanism that kind of came out after emancipation in 1838, in the middle of the 19th century, in this sort of Darwinian moment, there's a model that says that, hey, we're all human, and therefore human difference is based on different histories of culture, histories of material culture. That's how Pitt Rivers then turns into the theorist of the evolution of culture. It's how you say that some cultures, before you know it, you're saying that some cultures are superior to others. And of course, Augustus Pitt Rivers, being a soldier, built his theory of cultural superiority upon weaponry. So he began his theory of material culture in the collections of the Royal Armouries and of the USI, the United Services Institution, which is now the Royal United Services Institution, RUSI, which is a right-wing think tank, sort of military think tank. So they had a museum in London, and the Royal Armouries was a museum of weapons as well. The Pitt Rivers and other museums like it started as a museum of weapons. So Sylvia Wynter, the Caribbean sort of writer and theorist, has talked really eloquently about what she calls this moment in the middle of the 19th century of the invention of what she calls mono-humanism, which is, so we're all human, but that model of the human is yet again the white, male, able-bodied, that this same guy has snuck back in. And so you're all human, but on kind of the model of the Victorian image.
Sliding scale of humanity.
That's exactly right. So she talks about how the unfinished work of emancipation, the unfinished work of abolition, is about finding and appreciating sort of other forms of humanity. So anthropology, of course, at its best, is able to talk about how in different cultures, different parts of the world, different periods of time, the notion of what is human, the boundary between objects and humans, is sort of variable. So, for example, to take the example of the Benin Bronzes, for those people in Edo State who are demanding their return in the present, there isn't any sort of distinction that I would make as a curator, or I might make, in between human remains on the one side and cultural objects on the other. That's far more entangled in these sacred royal objects, which don't simply represent the ancestors, they constitute the ancestors. They are a part of the ancestral presence in the present. So when we say we want more human museums, we need to think really, we need to be careful that we're not talking about humanity in our own ethnocentric, Eurocentric.
Well, I'm sure the Mosaic probably weren't thinking of it.
I'm sure.
I'm sure that they were saying we are the version of humanity that is being projected is somewhat partial. I want to go back to this violence idea and move away, if you like, to stay with the Mosaic observation from the Benin Bronzes and things like this. You might know this, that I did an intervention, a photographic intervention at the Pitt Rivers.
Yeah.
And the thing that I found most chilling, actually, there was not actually the Benin Bronzes, but the guns upstairs, and one that Pitt Rivers, the founder of the museum, had invented, the P-53 Enfield rifle, that is implicated in the India uprising, because of the whole scandal with the cartridge paper, with pig fat, or that kicked off this whole thing, and I just wanted to draw attention to that in a sense. That isn't this ironic that we've got this museum that calls itself anthropological, and then upstairs on the top floor are these weapons, right? Yeah. And how do we tell that story, or should? I was actually, there's another object downstairs, actually, a jibba. It's a tunic that's worn by a warrior, Sudanese warrior. It's got a bullet hole in it.
Yeah, is it from Omdurman?
Yes, the Battle of Omdurman.
Which is just a year after the Benin.
Exactly, 1898. And it's got this bullet hole in it. And it was I thought to myself, there's these guns upstairs, and then there's this bullet hole, how do we kind of take that apart? How do we deal with that narrative of violence without even taking on board, the Benin Bronzes? There's something deeper embedded in the museum about the association between heritage and violence.
So I think a part of the thinking for the British Museums came out of the sense that the museum operates. So the motto of writing the book for me, one of the mottos, was as the border is to the nation state, so the museum is to empire. So work on, in academic circles, what's called border work, the work of, the border official, which we know happens in our universities and in our workplaces rather than just at the physical border. That has a lot in common with the work of the museum, in that both the museum and the national border are Victorian technologies, actually surprisingly recent technology, late 19th, early 20th century sort of technologies. I mean, sort of passports are really, are largely a product of the world after the First World War. But they are technologies for saying there are different types of people, for making distinctions between one bunch of people and another. And there was a point at which at the British Museum, because of the sort of concerns over terrorism and so on, they started to check your bag as you went in.
Yeah.
And so the visit to the British Museum turned into weirdly a bit like sort of as if you were at the airport. And the border-like nation, that sort of notion of the museum was revealed even more than ever. But the thing that happened after 9/11, you know, in airports, that was also happening at the British Museum, is they look in your bag, and there's this way of thinking of, well, what could be weaponised? How could is there anything in this bag that could be used to hurt someone? And it was that experience that I guess I joined the dots between, well, that, in terms of the objects on display in the museum, how many of these items are being weaponised? And in the Pitt Rivers, you see, because of over a century of a combination of kind of lack of funding and lack of vision, the museum just hasn't really changed very much. So you see what the British Museum used to be like, you see what these institutions used to be like, but are still like under the surface. And yeah, you see if you go to the Pitt Rivers, yeah, by far, absolutely. So when the Rose Must Fall movement sent the tweet that I talk about in the book that said the Pitt Rivers Museum is one of the most violent spaces in Oxford, absolutely, it is about the weapons, it is about a theory of culture and supremacy based on the fact that if I've got a better weapon than you, or you have a better weapon than me, that is going to determine the outcome of a war between us, which was sort of what his theory was. But then what happens is that art becomes weaponised, that objects of all kinds become used as weapons in the space.
Or the museum itself as an institution, because after the 30 Years' War, the Treaty of Westphalia, European museums become the weapons, actually. There is something about the very idea, there's some going back, and why the mosaic observation, it's so acute, that there's something about the very institution of the museum and these objects which is inherently violent, and you don't need to have a Benin bronze or a tunic with a bullet hole in it to get that sense that there's something about this that is about national status. And this is why the right-wing, the government don't want to give in to this, because they know this is their armour, this is their cultural arsenal, if you like. Thank you, Dad.
So we were meant to say something about how to buy the book, is that right?
All right, yeah, there's that.
Not first, and then I could do that.
Oh, okay, yeah, all right. Well, I just want to say thank you, Dan, for the conversation, which has been really animated and insightful. And I hope that for the audience, it was something that you found interesting and that you could engage with in terms of opening out the issues in Dan's book, but also the contemporary politics that are around at the moment around museums. That I hope this has given you a taste of what are the issues. And do visit, I just want to plug the organisation cultureand.org, because we are working to try and change the system. So you can check us on social media or visit our website. Yeah. But thank you very much.
If you enjoyed this episode, please subscribe wherever you find your podcasts for more literary events like this one. Thank you for listening.